boys and girls. It's Mrs. Crowley here. Good morning. I'm here with you today because I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a very special man from the Bible. And because it's a Bible story, I always like to light a candle and put it with the Bible to remind us it's a special story that Jesus gave to us. This happened when Jesus was alive a long time ago. So there's a couple things I want to ask you about to think about before we start the story. The first thing I want you to think about is, have you ever been to a parade? Yeah, I bet you have. St. Patrick's Day parade, 4th of July parade, Mardi Gras parade, all different kinds of parades you can go to. You know, there's lots of people who go to a parade. There are sometimes clowns and balloons and candy and people throwing candy and beads and music, bands playing, lots of things like that to hear and see at a parade. Because there's so many people, sometimes shorter people may have a hard time seeing, right? You may have experienced that because you haven't finished growing yet. So you may understand really well what that means and what that feels like. How do you feel when you're in a parade and you can't see? Ugh, not good, huh? Well, what could you do if you can't see in a parade? Well, if you're with your mom and dad, you might hold your arms up and say, can you hold me up higher so I can see? If you're in a big group and you could maybe say, excuse me, and make your way to the very front so you could see better. Sometimes people are nice to let children come up to the front to see, and their moms and dads can kind of stand in the back. Sometimes you might want to look behind you for a place to get higher, like on a ladder or up some stairs or up high in a window of a building or a house or on a roof. I've heard some people watch parades from their roof sometimes. So to get up high is a good place too. You're going to need this information and remember all these things you're thinking about parades for this story. The other thing I want to talk to you about for a minute is a job that was held by a man many, many years ago when Jesus was alive. And that job is called tax collector. And one of the men in the story that I'm going to tell you was a tax collector. His name was Zaccheus. You might have heard the story about Zaccheus before. It's one of my favorites. But Zaccheus was not a good tax collector. He did not make good choices all the time. A tax collector does work for the king or the leader, collects money from people, pay a little bit of taxes, money, to the tax collector, and then the tax collector takes that money and gives it to the king. The king uses the money to keep the city clean, build new buildings, fix the roads, and make it a nice place to live. So Zaccheus was a tax collector, but the people did not like Zaccheus. It was because he was not a fair tax collector. He wasn't fair. He didn't make good choices when he collected the money. He asked the people to pay him the money for the king, and he made them pay more just to him. And he took the extra money and he put it in his pocket and kept it for himself. So he had beautiful clothes and beautiful things, and he lived in a beautiful house, and he had wonderful food, more than anyone else had, because he took this extra money from the people. So I want you to remember these two things that I talked about, parades and tax collectors, and this man named Zaccheus, because they're all important to this story. Well, I've set up the table a little bit already. I put a purple cloth down on the table to remind us we're in the season of Lent. We're preparing for Easter. And who leads us to the ideas and stories of Easter but Jesus? So this will be Jesus in our story. There's a road on the mat also. The road is leading to Jerusalem. This is going to mean the city of Jerusalem. It's a crucifix, and the crucifix reminds us of Jesus on the cross. and it was in Jerusalem that Jesus was put on the cross. So I'm going to use that to mean Jerusalem. Well, this story takes place one day when Jesus was traveling down the road going to Jerusalem, and he was passing through the town of Jericho. And he was traveling with his friends. Remember his 12 special friends who gave up everything, left their home to travel with Jesus to help him spread his words and God's ways to everyone. So they came to teach with Jesus. So they were traveling with him that day down the road on the way to Jericho. The people in Jericho came out of their homes and they started talking and telling each other, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. And they had heard the stories about Jesus turning water into wine, feeding 5,000 people with just a little bit of food, curing the blind man, giving him his sight, calming the sea and the storm. They had heard all these stories about this man, and they wanted to go and see him. So people came out of their homes, and they lined the road, and there were so many people. There was a crowd everywhere. Have just a few people, but use your imagination and put hundreds of people along the road so that it was impossible to see if you were someone who was kind of short. Well, that man I mentioned before, Zaccheus, he was very short. He was a grown-up, but he just wasn't very tall. So Zaccheus, even though he didn't always make good choices, and the people didn't like him very much, he was curious about that man named Jesus. So he left his work and he walked to the place in the road where Jesus was going to be, and he could not see. There were too many people in his way, and because they didn't always like what Zaccheus did, they would not let him go up to the front. And no one would pick him up because he was a grown-up, not a child. So he could not see, and he really wanted to see this man. Nearby, there was a sycamore tree, which is a kind of tree that was growing along the road that day. And Zaccheus had the idea, I'm going to climb up someplace high, just like this sycamore tree right here. So up to the top of the sycamore tree, inside he went, hanging on the branches, maybe found a nice branch to sit in and get comfy. And Jesus and his apostles walked down the road. And people were probably cheering for him, calling out to him, Jesus, and waving to him like that and telling him, look over here, Jesus, we're so glad you're here. Pray for us, Jesus. Perform a miracle for us. They were asking him all kinds of things. And Jesus had only one idea. Jesus stopped in the road next to the sycamore tree, walked over to the sycamore tree, stopped right in front of it, looked up to the very top where Zaccheus was, and he called out his name and said, Zaccheus. He didn't say, who are you up there in that tree? He knew who he was. Zaccheus, come down. I would like to go to your home today and sit with you. What? Zaccheus heard those words. Can you wonder with me how he must have felt when he heard Jesus call his name? Jesus knew who he was. He had never met Jesus before. How did Jesus know? We've talked about that before because Jesus is God and he knows everything. So Zaccheus climbed down from the tree and he stood next to Jesus. And they began to walk away toward his home. Oh, I wonder how Zaccheus felt when Jesus called his name and said, I want to go to your house. Do you think he felt honored? Did he feel happy? Was he scared? Was he nervous? Was he surprised? How do you think he felt? The people who were standing around Jesus and Zacchaeus, they started grumbling though. Why is Jesus going to that man's house? He is a tax collector. He is a sinner. Why is he going to his house? They grumbled and rumbled and complained about that. But that didn't stop Jesus and Zacchaeus. And they walked away on the way to Zacchaeus' house. What Jesus did touched Zacchaeus in a way he'd never been touched before. Zacchaeus said to Jesus, Jesus, I promise I will give back all the money I have taken, and I will give half of my own money to the poor. And Jesus looked at Zacchaeus and he said, I, the special Son of God, have come to find and to save everyone who is lost. And from that day on, Zacchaeus became one of Jesus's disciples who followed him and listened to him and stayed close to him. Not one of his apostles, but one of his disciples. Wow. Do you think Zacchaeus was a little bit lost before he met Jesus? I wonder how you could be a tax collector and be lost. That doesn't mean he was lost from his home. He was lost from someone else. He was lost from God because he chose bad choices. He was lost from God. And Jesus said, I have come to save everyone who is lost. I wonder if that's why Jesus chose Zacchaeus that day instead of anyone else. He knew how lost Zacchaeus was. So Jesus did a very wonderful thing for Zacchaeus, and I'm going to leave you with this idea. Maybe you can talk about it with your mom or dad. Jesus, who is God, forgave Zacchaeus all those bad choices. He forgave him. We are sometimes asked to forgive too. We'll talk more about that another day. Thanks so much for listening to the story. And there are some links on your calendar this week that a little story you can watch, a song you can learn, and we may practice that song on another day. So everyone have a great day, and thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.